Yes, I think that might be a delicious shot. So in today's video, I'm actually going to teach you something. Yes, I know, it's kind of ridiculous, but every now and then I've got to bust out the old technique. And in fact, what this video is it's a free preview of my upcoming online photography course entitled Mastering Sharpness. And the reason why I decided to do this course, which I'm recording as we speak, is because over the last 10-13 years, I think the most commonly asked question that I've ever received is, how do you get such sharp images? And the good news is it's just technique. It's something that you can learn yourself just by doing the right things. And it's nothing to do with sharpening your images at the end. I mean, we all do that, but that's not going to help you very much if you don't capture a super sharp image in camera. Now, mastering sharpness is going to teach you everything, right from the very basics, how to set up your camera, all of the techniques that you're going to use in camera to capture the sharpest possible image. And of course I will do some post-production sharpening at the end, but really that's not what this course is about. And this video today that you're going to get to see from beginning to end is all about diffraction. So what is diffraction? Well, in layman's terms, and you know me, that's really the only terms that I ever really understand. It's the phenomenon by which light gets bent around an obstruction. So when you look at a camera, what does the lens do? Well, it basically blocks light. Its purpose is to block light and control how that light enters the lens and hits the sensor or the film, if you're a film shooter. And it goes through what we call an aperture, which means opening. And of course, we get to control the width of that aperture. We get to control how wide that opening gets. Now, I should say that no matter what aperture you select, that there is some diffraction, whether you're shooting wide open or whether you stop down all the way to your narrowest aperture. Diffraction is going to happen at every possible aperture. However, it really doesn't become a visible problem in your image until you get to the extreme ends of your aperture range.
Now everybody loves a nice diagram, don't they? Alright, well don't laugh, I tried my best. Okay, so here's my camera. Now let's zoom in a bit and then we'll darken things down so that we can drop in some overlays. The blue area represents the sensor. Now this is not to scale, it's just an approximation, so definitely don't build your PhD on this. And the red area represents the aperture ring. And that black space in the middle is the aperture of f2.8, which is the widest it goes on this lens. But let's move the text down here so that now we can let in some light, which obviously is represented in yellow. As you can see, when the light waves get restricted by the aperture, it scatters the light waves just a little bit, even when the aperture is wide open. And this is what we call diffraction. Now that diffraction isn't too bad until we have to stop down and make that aperture smaller to, let's say, f22. The smaller we make it, the more extreme the diffraction, and that's where we see a drop in overall sharpness and resolution.
Now, I don't want you to stop watching this video, but I should say that if you just exclusively post your images on something like Instagram, you never print your images, you never post them online in a large format, then really I would say that diffraction is not something that you need to worry about. That slight loss of sharpness is not going to even be noticeable on an Instagram post. You're just not going to see it because of the resolution and the medium that you're looking at it on. But even if you do that, I would still recommend, however, that you shoot the best quality images that you possibly can, because you don't know where your career is going to go. You might think, I'm just an Instagram photographer now, but you will get those gigs where someone comes along and says, oh, I really love that image, can I license it for a magazine cover? We just need it high resolution and we need it super sharp. And then you send them this sort of medium resolution f22 shot and it's kind of blurry, it's not very sharp. And when they saw it on Instagram, they thought it was great. but now that they're looking at the best image you can provide, it's not up to snuff. But I'll confess, I'm not a physics expert. I'm not even really that bright, to be quite honest with you. But I don't need to have a degree in physics to understand the consequences of what diffraction will do to my images as a landscape photographer. Typically, it is something that I want to avoid. Now, if you've been watching this channel for years, you've probably seen many instances where I'm shooting an image at an aperture of f/22. And the reason why I'm doing that is usually to force a long exposure. I'm usually doing it to drag the shutter. However, almost every single time you've seen me do that, in addition to taking that slightly diffracted long exposure, I've also shot an image at f8 or f11 that is nowhere near as badly diffracted as f22, and what I typically do is just blend the two together in Photoshop to get the best of both worlds, and it just saves me having to climb, well, let's say I've crossed a river and my camera bag is over there, it just saves me the hassle of going all that way to get more gear. I should also point out that even though the narrowest apertures, stopping all the way down to something like f22, will give you a soft image, you should also know that even if you shoot wide open, those focused parts of your wide open aperture image will not be as sharp as something like f5.6 or something closer to the center of your aperture range. So then the question is, what aperture should you use, and why do you choose certain apertures? Okay, so let's just assume that, like me, you're a bit of a nerd and you just bought a new lens and you've spent quite a bit of time experimenting to figure out which aperture gives you the sharpest results. You've taken the same shot over and over again with different apertures, and the only thing that you change is the aperture and of course the shutter speed, because as you stop down it gets a little bit darker. Usually you'll take 5 or 6 test shots at various apertures and then just study those at like 100% in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever you use, and you'll quickly determine which aperture gives you the sharpest results. But there's a slight problem with that, because at f5.6, yeah, you might get super sharp results, but you might not have enough depth of field to get everything inside of your focal plane. Let's say I focused on this tree over here, which I have. At an aperture of f5.6, I might find that this rock just over here, which is about 16 feet away, maybe 14 feet, I might find that that is slightly blurred. It's not inside of my plane of focus, it's outside of it, because at f5.6, I wouldn't call it shallow depth of field, but it's certainly not f22, where everything is supposed to be inside of your focal plane, but probably quite blurry. So what do you do? What do you do to get maximum sharpness, but enough depth of field that most of your image is in focus? Well, obviously you're going to stop down. So you're going to find that sweet spot. That's why you call it a sweet spot, because to be honest, it's a compromise, right? You're compromising sharpness and balancing that with depth of field. It's how much of my image can I keep in perfect focus with a slight trade-off of sharpness. And what I've found with this lens, this is the 16 to 35 G Master, so Sony, I found that this is really sharp at f8, and f8 will usually give me the kind of depth of field that I want, depending on how close I am to my foreground. So that is my foreground, that rock there in this composition, and at f8 it's still pretty sharp. Now, the other thing that you might want to compromise is shutter speed in terms of dragging the shutter. So you might be forced to stop down even more. Even though everything's super sharp and everything is within your focal plane, you might still want to stop down even more. So I might want to go down to f11, which again is still acceptably sharp. By the time you've processed the image and you've added a little bit of sharpening, is there really that much difference between an f5.6 shot and an f11 shot? Not really. The difference is I've got more depth of field and I'm able to drag the shutter ever so slightly. So if you look at these bubbles that are just meandering down the river, the longer I can drag that shutter, the more of a streak they will leave, which is kind of pleasing. Now, as I talked about before, I could stop all the way down to f22 and just mask in Photoshop a very long exposure. So this could be like 4 seconds or something like that. And I wouldn't care about diffraction because I'm not going to keep, let's say, the rocks or the tree. I'm not going to keep any of that from that f22 frame. And again, I will show you how to do that in my course, Mastering Sharpness. But I thought I'd just touch a little bit on depth of field and how it relates to finding your sweet spot.
To figure out your sharpest aperture, take several shots of the same image, all at different apertures, kind of like the ones shown here, and then simply study the results at 100% magnification. Or if you prefer a lazier method, just go to websites like opticallimits.com and look under lens reviews and pick a lens you own or that you're thinking of buying. And one of the lenses I own is the Zeiss Batiste 18mm f2.8. So let's click on that, and I always skip to page 2 and I scroll down, and then you'll find the MTF chart, the modulation transfer function, which measures optical performance. Now, if you look at this chart, you'll see instantly that f5.6 has the best center sharpness and near center sharpness, with a noticeable drop in sharpness at f11. What I find really useful though is this summary up here. It says diffraction effects kick in at f8 and gets noticeable at f11. That may be a little surprising, but f8 should be good enough for infinity scenes. Anyway, avoid f16 and beyond. Another great resource to learn about lens performance is lensrentals.com. That's got some really good info on there. And as well as that, you can often just get MTF charts directly from the lens manufacturer, along with instructions on how to read the different types of charts.
Now, if you're going to do this little experiment with all of your lenses, which I really recommend that you do, just understand that every lens is different, every manufacturer is different. You're not going to get the same results on every single lens. So for example, I've determined that f8 is the sweet spot on this lens, but on my 100 to 400, it's f16, right? Because that lens goes all the way from f5.6 at the widest aperture, and you can stop down right to f32. But just like this, I've determined through experimentation that f16 gives me a very, very sharp image, but I also get a bit more depth of field than I would if I was shooting wide open. And if I shoot at f32, it's just awful. It's just terrible. But if I need to force that long shutter, that long exposure, I can do that with f32 on that lens. So just understand that when you do this experiment, you will have a different number for every single lens. And of course, it all depends on your composition as well. So if you determine that f16 on a 100 to 400 is perfect for a starting point, you might quickly find if you're zooming into something and there's something in the foreground, let's say a rock or a tree, that is blurred, then you're going to have to stop down a little bit, or better still, focus stack. Okay, so now I'm going to explain this shot that I've just framed up here and my thought process and my logic when it comes to deciding which aperture to use or what the sweet spot is for this type of shot. And some of this depends on focus, like where you're going to focus. And I do cover where to focus on another part of this course, but for right now, let me just talk to you about this shot. So what I've done is I've focused on this really beautiful tree here that's leaning over the creek, and I just love this root system. So I started at f5.6 because through experimentation I have determined that is a very sharp aperture. And you'll remember from my comment earlier that that might not give me enough depth of field. So if you look at these rocks here, when I check my playback on my image, when I shoot the image and then I hit play and I zoom in to my playback, I find that this is not particularly sharp, and this gets even softer when I'm shooting at f5.6. So what do? I just stop down. So you'll see this get darker, obviously. So I'm going to stop down to, let's say, f8, I did that. I took a test shot at f8 and it was a little bit blurry still, just in this area here. So what do? You stop down again to f11. And that's the sweet spot. Now, you've seen that the image is getting very dark, so of course you're going to have to change your shutter speed. I wouldn't touch the ISO because I really don't want to get noise. But that is the balancing act that you're going to be playing. That's the compromise to find that sweet spot. For this particular image, it's f11. It's not going to be the same for every image that you shoot because of your distance. Let me just brighten it up. Because of your distance from the front of the lens to your first foreground subjects, like this area here and that area there. It's always going to be different. Your composition forces you to change these settings. But if you've got a good starting point, let's say f5.6 or f8, f11, whichever one you want, it only takes a split second to adjust it. But if you have a nice starting point, that's going to get you up and running a lot quicker. But I must stress the absolute importance of taking a couple of test shots and always zooming in afterwards to see, did you get sharpness and did you get depth of field throughout your image, if that's what you want.
Hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget, you can pre-order Mastering Sharpness right now and enjoy that early bird discount. There's a link in the description. Next week's episode will be right back to some shenanigans, as well as some spectacular landscape photography.